morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots of interesting stories to talk about this morning, including oral arguments in a landmark free speech case in front of the Supreme Court. This one is really, really interesting, cuts across ideological lines, deals with a lot of very thorny issues around state power and social media. So we're going to dig into that and tell you what the implications could be. We also have some new theories out about something we talked about yesterday, Trump's consistent underperformance in the primaries that have been held so far. Nate Cohn did an analysis of different theories of why that may be occurring. So we're going to take a look at that and what that could mean for the future and for the general election. We also have new details about the death of Russian dissident Alexei Navalny that we're going to get into, what exactly the hell happened there. Interesting details that are coming out now from his team and from others. Joe Biden was on late night. That's all I got to say about that.
Way.
Yeah, we've got
some ice cream.
We've got some highlights from that to bring to you. Also today is the primary in Michigan, and obviously Joe Biden very much expected to win. However, a very open question about how many voters, especially young voters, are going to cast their ballot for uncommitted as a rebuke of Joe Biden and his unconditional support for Israel. Jon Stewart was back on last night with some Israel takes. We'll take a look at that. And I am looking at an extraordinary scandal that is unfolding right now at the New York Times that is just absolutely unbelievable. This woman with literally no journalistic experience ending up with a byline on one of the most fraught and sensitive stories of all time that has now been discredited. I can't even believe some of the details here, so we'll break all of that down for you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to hear that report. As a reminder, for BreakingPoints.com, you can become a premium subscriber. We're doing a exclusive subscriber-only live stream after the State of the Union, where our subscribers can interact with us and ask questions. You're going to learn some more details, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So if you could support that and all of our work, we're already developing new focus groups. We've got the State of the Union special, etc. You can go ahead and sign up for that. But let's go ahead and begin with this social media case, because it is probably one of the most significant First Amendment cases to come before the court in quite a long time. It comes down to two separate laws in the state of Florida and the state of Texas, which were designed by these two state legislatures to try and protect quote-unquote conservative viewpoints. But the legal question before the court, and is actually frankly very interesting, is this. Do the tech platforms, are they common carriers as classified by these state legislatures, AKA like the internet company, which doesn't censor information that you or I, might be pinging and it doesn't have any say at editorial judgment? Or are they editorial platforms that have the right to pick and choose the way that a newspaper would, the way that you or I would? The reason why this is all at play is it comes back to the way that they were originally classified, where the tech companies effectively are both allowed to behave as quasi-common carriers because of the monopolistic effects of the network, basically the network effects of their business, but also because of pre-existing law from 1996, Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act, which also allow them to have some editorial judgment. So basically, the states have passed these separate laws. They're now before the court. The people who are challenging the laws are the trade organization, which represents all of the big tech companies. We have a little bit of flavor from the arguments, which showed some skepticism, but also some interesting alignment between some of the liberal justices and the Republicans, and then some of the more conservative justices who are countering. First, here, we're going to play for you some questioning by Justice Alito of the lawyers about who exactly is making speech determinations, what the algorithm is, and how the mechanics of this all work. Let's take a listen.
They're not going to see a bunch of material that glorifies suicide.
Is there any distinction between action or editing that takes place as a result of an algorithm as opposed to an individual?
I don't think so, Your Honor. These algorithms don't spring from the ether. They are essentially computer programs designed by humans to try to do some of this editorial function.
But what do you do with, say, deep learning algorithm, which teaches itself and has very little human intervention?
You still had to have somebody who kind of created the universe that algorithm is going to look at.
So who's speaking then? The algorithm or the person?
I think the question in these cases would be the Facebook is speaking, that YouTube is speaking, because they're the ones that are using these devices to run their editorial discretion across these massive volumes. And the reason they're doing this, and of course they're supplementing it with lots and lots of humans as well, but the reason they have to use the algorithms, of course, is the volume of material on these sites, which just shows you the volume of editorial discretion.
Yeah, and finally, I'm sorry to keep going, Mr. Clement, exactly what are they saying? So, what is the algorithm saying? I don't know. I'm not on any, but what is it saying?
It's saying,
is it a consistent message? Usually when we had Hurley, it was their parade, and they didn't want certain people in their parade. You understood that. What are they saying here?
They're saying things like Facebook doesn't want pro-terrorist stuff on our site.
Okay, so as you can see, there's a little bit of the pushback there from the lawyers for them. But Krystal, it's a very interesting question. And it really comes back to, as I said, some of the press release, for example, that they put out. They go, just as Florida may not tell the New York Times what opinion pieces to publish or Fox News what interviews to air, it may not tell Facebook and YouTube what content to disseminate. He's looping in the algorithm with the plugged-in editorial judgment. The crux of the Texas and the Florida law are that there is a baseline free speech assumption, especially in the case of the Florida law, that applies to elected representatives that does not allow for editorial discretion of these quote-unquote standards to come into play. I think it's a very important one.
Yeah.
I definitely support the law, even if it may be intended to be, applied solely or whatever to conservative viewpoints. But I think that's why we've seen even liberal outlets and people who are skeptical of technology and not really necessarily supportive of Texas or Florida, who say that if they rule in the opposite direction, you're giving them carte blanche to censor whatever they want.
Yeah, I'd encourage you to, in some ways, put aside the specifics of the motivations of these particular laws and think about the core issues here. So the argument from the tech companies is effectively like the libertarian argument. We are, we have these companies and we have a right to basically run them the way that we want. We have a right to enforce our terms of service. We are not a government, so we are not subject to free speech laws, and basically we can do what we want on our platforms. On the other side is states like Florida and Texas, and presumably other states around the country that also have an interest in this, saying, no, this is the modern public square. Free speech is incredibly important for society on these platforms because that is the way our society is constituted at this point. And the state has an interest in making sure that there is some level of free speech, especially with regard to elections and candidates, that is protected and preserved on these platforms. And so the interest of citizens and of the state in protecting free speech rights is superior to the interest of, these companies that are arguing, no, we have free speech rights to, publish on our platforms what we want. The other thing that I would say here in terms of these companies, Saagar, is they really want to have it both ways.
Yeah, exactly.
In terms of this question about whether they're common carriers or whether they're publishers. When they don't want responsibility for bad things that are published on their platforms, then they're not publishers, they're common carriers. They don't want any liability and any responsibility for the content that's going out on their platforms. But when they want to effectively please their advertisers and protect their business models, then, we're publishers, this is our speech, we have to protect our free speech rights here, and we're just making editorial judgments in the same way as the New York Times.
Yes.
And I would say basically, you can't have it both ways. And so to me, that's sort of the core of the issue here. Now, I do think that the questions are somewhat complex, right? I do think it is a thorny, tricky issue to legislate, okay, where is the line? How much can these states just dictate to companies how to run their platforms and who to censor and who not to censor? I mean, that can get into very tricky grounds as well. But when I think about it at bottom, when you have this core competition between, the corporations and the state, at least the state, there's some sort of theoretical democratic mechanism for making these choices and having citizen input into a way that free speech is mediated and moderated and, permitted on these platforms versus with a company, whether it's a public company or a private company. Like, you have no say. It's just up to these few oligarchs what they feel like doing on their platform, with massive costs and consequences, as we've seen for society.
I'll continue and dig into a little bit what you said, where you're talking about liability. And this is something that we can understand, but people who are not in publishing may not, which is, at the end of the day, as editorial organizations like Breaking Points, like the New York Times, or others, we, because we curate information, are also liable under defamation and libel law. As in, if we were to publish something which was, absolutely wrong, and that somebody could then prove that we knew it was wrong before we published it, we did it specifically to defame or libel somebody else, they could take us to court. But the Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act actually allows the social media companies not to be liable under the same standard. As in, if I take to Facebook and I quote unquote defame somebody else, that person cannot sue Facebook for platforming defamation. So in that case, they're trying to treat themselves as a common carrier. In the same way that a common carrier like AT&T, they have no editorial judgment over who I pick up and call. They don't drop my phone call because I'm saying problematic things. Now, maybe the government will, but that's a different story. In terms of how the actual company itself, which has allowed this effective legalistic monopoly or regulatory monopoly on top of the service that they provide, even though it's a private company, we classify it under a very different set of standards, the same way that Comcast and ISP internet providers do as well. The social media companies are in this weird gray area, and actually thought Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson did a really good job of digging into this about elected officials and the elected official standard under the Florida law, which allows anyone running for public office not to be subject specifically to this. Really listen to the counter argument being given by the social media company and some of the democratic implications. Let's take a listen.
We want to have.
All right, well, what about a straightforward one, right? I understood that one of these was no candidate can be deplatformed. That seems pretty straightforward.
Right.
And so why isn't that enforcing anti-discrimination principles? If somebody's a candidate for office, they can't be deplatformed.
So that means they can't be deplatformed no matter how many times they violate my client's terms of use, no matter how horrible their conduct, no matter how misrepresenting they are in their speech. We still have to carry it, and not just have to carry it, but under this statute, we have to give it pride of place. And it doesn't take much to register as a candidate in Florida. And so this gives a license to anybody, even if there's, somebody who's only going to poll, 2% in their local precinct, they can post anything they want. They can cause us to fundamentally change our editorial policies and have to ignore our terms of use.
So that's really worth digging into. When he says it, you're like, oh, well, that seems, reasonable or whatever. But I'm like, well, okay, let's hold on a second. How do you get from 2% to 10%? Anyone want to tell me? Maybe it's by being able to reach voters, which is online. Mm-hmm. So, if the state of Florida makes it so that anybody can get on the ballot and poll at 2%, I mean, listen, what have we all learned from the RFK Jr. thing? It ain't that easy to get on the ballot, okay? And so if you can get there, then you should be in a place where you are in a level playing field against other candidates on the social media companies. I don't see what's exactly wrong with that. And when you phrase it that way, you can then understand some of the inverse ways where this could apply. As we all learned post-January 6th with the deplatforming of Trump from Twitter, the simultaneous deplatforming, and really the simultaneous destruction of Parler, you're like, whoa, you have companies which are technically separate, effectively working in concert from a major social pressure campaign, and the company and even the individual, at that point, the sitting president of the United States, has no genuine recourse to reach millions and millions of people. We're not talking about a plumbing business in Ohio here. We're talking about the basically singular ways which the vast majority of Americans are interacting with presidential candidates and fundraising. And so when you consider it in that vein, we come much more to the common carrier status. Again, the companies don't want this because they simply want to be able to do what they want to do so it doesn't affect their advertising businesses.
That's it.
But these are multi-trillion-dollar companies. If we look at their market cap, I don't even think, honestly, it would have that much of an effect, especially if they're legally required, Krystal. What are they going to do? They're going to be like, hey, we have to legally do it. What are we supposed to do?
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. And especially if they're all held to the same standard, then it's an even playing field. I mean, the core tension here is this question.
Yeah.
Do citizens have an interest in the way these platforms are run that goes above and beyond the profit motive of the companies themselves. Because that is kind of the unspoken part of all of this, and you just pointed to it, Saagar, in terms of the advertising dollars.
Yeah.
The reason these companies are making the decisions they are, whether it's kicking Trump off the platform or, moderating speech in the ways that they do, it's all because of profit. It's not because they, are interested in speech. It's not because they have some message that they want to convey through their algorithm the way that, a newspaper wants to publish the news and cover it in a certain way. No, they're making these decisions because they believe they're the decisions that will maximize profit. So where do we place in our order of priorities the desire for these companies, their owners, their shareholders to maximize their profits, and the interest that citizens have in having platforms that, enable free speech, that allow them to understand candidates and their platforms, that allow candidates to be able to run and get their message out, even if they aren't the best funded. And so, it's very much my position that this is the modern town square, that we do all very much have an interest in what goes on here, and that in some certain ways, when you're talking about core rights like free speech, they do trump the prerogatives of these companies to run their platforms in precisely the way that they think will absolutely maximize profit. And you're right. I don't think it would be massively harmful to them if they had to comply with these laws. One of the things that would be implicated here definitely with the Florida law, I think with both the Florida and the Texas law, but because you're dealing with the way that the algorithm promotes and suppresses content, you would also have to have some level of transparency around how those decisions are being made, what content is being promoted, what content is being suppressed. And so it would also give us a tool to be able to understand the inner workings of these companies in a way that I think would be extraordinarily beneficial just in terms of transparency and, sunlight being an incredible disinfectant. So there is a lot at stake here. Again, I'm not going to pretend like the issues aren't tricky and that there isn't an important balance to strike here, et cetera. But to me, at its core, this tension between a democratic society, our interest in speech, which is, a core constitutional right, and the interest of these companies to just absolutely maximize their profit, there is a limiting principle there. Our rights as citizens of this country trump their rights to, do whatever they want on the platform in the interest of maximizing profit.
Yeah, and I think, it's okay, YouTube, the platform where a lot of you are consuming this right now. I don't think people understand the scale. YouTube in 2023 accounted for $31.5 billion in profit. That is just 10% of Google's overall revenue. And that 31 billion is bigger than Netflix. How much money Netflix made in the year 2023. 10% of Google is roughly equivalent to Netflix, which is one of the most predominant streaming platforms in the whole world. YouTube is media now, basically, at this point. And this is just here, I'm talking in the US context. I've talked to you about this before, Krystal, but in many countries like India or in South America as well, which did not have the same analog TV, YouTube is media because they don't have cable television in the same way. Everybody skipped and started the entry point at the mobile phone level, and with data, that is the major way that people consume not just news, everything, television shows. And when you think about the dramatic cultural power that something like that has, not only here, but all around the world, you start to understand why I think common carrier status is not only justified now, I mean, it would have been justified many, many years ago. So let's put this up there on the screen from the Wall Street Journal. I encourage people to read this if they want a decent primer on some of the things that were, at play. I would note, based on the arguments, it definitely did seem as if the majority of the conservative justices were not on the side of the red states in this case, using a much more libertarian point of view in some of their questioning. Let's go to the next one there, please. This is Net Choice. It's kind of a write-up of their specific allegations as to why the law should be allowed to stand. It basically just comes back to an argument is that they're private companies. No matter at the scale, they should not have to be told by the government how and when and which way to run their business. But I mean, that even to me falls apart a little bit, Krystal, because you and I have all kinds of regulations that we have to comply, like workers' comp. Anybody who runs a business, you have to buy workers' comp, right? I think that's fine. Or, you know, if you're a certain size, like you have to provide health insurance. If you're a plumbing company, you have to have a trade certification. You can't just be going out and doing anything. You know, there's all kinds of things that we're all required to do.
Minimum wage.
Right, we have to pay minimum wage. There's so many different things that we all have to do whenever we run a business. I don't necessarily enjoy it all, but we don't have a choice. So the idea then at a baseline level that, you know, this principle, like you can't tell people what and what not to do, it's like, well, we already do that. It's just that we're trying to apply it to a 21st century standard. If anything, I think we're some 20 years late.
That's a good point. That's actually a very good point. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of how this case is going to play out, I genuinely don't know. There was questioning that, you know, from both ends of the ideological spectrum that seemed pretty skeptical of the presentation coming from these companies. So it left me somewhat hopeful that they will rule in favor of free speech and the rights of states to regulate these companies in the interests of citizens to, you know, have the First Amendment protected. But I genuinely don't know how it's ultimately going to play out because, you know, it's tricky and it's not an ideologically clear-cut case. As you said, just thinking about the right, you know, you have these competing ideological strands of, you know, this newfound, at least rhetorical interest in free speech. And then the, you know, sort of radical libertarian strain that has been on the rise in the Republican Party for decades at this point. So which of those ideologies wins out here among the conservative justices who obviously have a significant majority on the court is really an open question.
We don't know. You know, I hope this has been a decent enough primer just so people can really dig into it. However this happens, we won't know for several months, of course, in terms of how this all plays out. It's going to have big, big impacts. And especially consider this, Krystal, if it comes before the 2024 election, who knows? November could be a very interesting. Imagine if they do uphold the legislation. November could be very interesting in terms of what's allowed to stand and what's not.
Yeah, well, and that's an important note. Is right now these laws are on hold.
Right.
They haven't been implemented while they go through the court system, and these justices make a decision. So we will see how it all turns out.
There you go.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.